Thank you all for coming back and joining us on day 2 of the Emerging Scholars Symposium, Visualing Identity, Exploring Dimensions of the Self Through Art. I'm Charlotte Guy, the president of the Association of Graduate Art Students. Yesterday, we heard 4 fascinating presentations exploring identity through various mediums of art. And today we will continue the conversation as we learn from 4 more emerging scholars. I want to remind everyone of the shift in schedule to today's program. Unfortunately, with the inclement weather in Texas, Kirsten Jacobson is unable to present her research on the identities of power from the late antique Roman Empire. Caroline Fucci will now be presenting first in today's lineup, and the break has been extended, but the afternoon presentations will remain at their originally scheduled time, beginning at 2:45. I'm happy to open up and introduce our first session, which considers identity and art through the lens of Latin American artists and sitters. Our presenters include Caroline Fucci, who recently received her master's from the University of Edinburgh, and Gwen Unger, who is currently pursuing her PhD in art history at Columbia University. At this time, I will invite Caroline to join us on screen to present her research titled Tarsila do Amaral, a Negra, the portrait of the Black woman and the legacy of colonialism in Brazil. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. So thank you, everyone, for organizing this symposium, and I'm really glad to participate. Today, I'm going to talk about Tarsila do Amaral's painting A Negra. But before that, I would like to make some remarks regarding the notion of global modernism. Although modern art is usually associated with European and North American traditions, its historical development should be regarded as a global phenomenon. The constant flux of visual references, cross-border relations, international dynamics, and exchange of ideas are some of the elements that made modernism such an innovative movement. It is worth noting that most artworks of the modern period were created in the context of cosmopolitan cities where unusual artistic encounters enabled cultural dialogues. In this setting, artists employed acts of appropriation as a means of investigating and inventing different aspects of modernism across the globe. Many modern art practices promoted scholarly discussions that touched upon issues of primitivism, Orientalism, and Occidentalism, to name just a few. And I argue that the study of global modernisms necessarily entails the understanding of colonial legacies. The colonization processes taking place in many Latin American countries throughout the 19th and 20th centuries have played a considerable role in the various types of modernization. For those former colonies, modernity symbolized the construction of cultural identity, at first glance detached from colonial legacies. However, Latin American modernism has undoubtedly been affected by colonialism. Most Latin American modernist artists found themselves at an in-between stage. They held a strong sense of identity and belonging, identifying with the West, but still desired to build a unique national culture separate from the Euro-American perspective. In 20th century Brazil, the miscegenation arising from Portuguese colonization and its ethnic complexities became, even if indirectly, a relevant subject for art production. Tarsila do Amaral, the artist I'm going to talk about today, is regarded as a leading Latin American modernist and a true pioneer of modernism in Brazil. Widely known as Tarsila, her work is famous for the synthesis of Brazilian motifs and European avant-garde trends. The work of Tarsila is regarded as a starting point for Brazilian modern art production in the 1920s and as a visual reference for later avant-garde movements in the country. Born to a wealthy family from São Paulo, Tarsila lived most of her childhood on her family's coffee farm. She showed an interest in the arts from an early age and had access to the very best art classes in São Paulo. Tarsila then traveled to Paris in 1920 to enhance her artistic skills and experience life abroad. Due to her social status and family wealth, she fitted in well in the French capital and soon joined intellectual circles. Tarsila's initial encounter with Cubism and exchanges with many European artists and writers such as André Lotte, Fernand Léger, and Blaise Cendrars would later arouse crucial elements in her work. It is worth mentioning that primitivism, which is defined as a modernist artist's interest in the primitive objects in non-Western art forms for the development of their works, was a dominant cultural attitude in 20th century France. It is impossible not to talk about Tarsila and her body of work without mentioning the anthropophagic movement, which is, together with her husband, the Brazilian intellectual and poet Oswald de Andrade, Tarsila envisioned the creation of a unique Brazilian identity from culture cannibalism of European aesthetic traditions. Such cannibalism did not imply the copy, but rather the ingestion and digestion of European styles to create a new and authentic Brazilian art. Conscious of European trends of the time and keen to be accepted as a modernist artist in the West, Tarsila and other artists who were part of the anthropophagic movement sought Brazilian iconographies or a type of Brazilianness that could represent their own accounts of the primitive. The Brazilian version of the primitive, therefore, was oriented towards an exploration of the inland or the countryside. I would argue that the development of modern art in Brazil was highly associated with the notion of uncivilized. So this is a quote from Tarsila from 1923. After spending some time in Paris, she returned to Brazil with the purpose of visiting Bahia, which is one of the regions that experienced the most significant Atlantic slave trade between the 16th and 19th centuries, marked by the Portuguese colonization. At that time, she announced to a Brazilian newspaper, quote, "I am profoundly Brazilian and will study the taste and the art of our caipiras," one quote. The Brazilian Portuguese word caipira dates back to the colonial period and denotes individuals, especially those of indigenous or African descent, who reside in the countryside. In view of Tarsila's statement, what was actually regarded the taste and the art of the so-called caipira? This is the painting A Negra. So Tarsila's paintings have been regarded as legitimate representations of Brazilian landscapes, culture, and people. However, most of the scholarship on her body of work overlooks its underlying social relations, including complex racial issues that have shaped Brazilian contemporary society. So I will analyze Tarsila's seminal piece in order to rethink well-established art historical approaches to her work and discuss the ideological and cultural attitudes underpinning her representations of the Afro-Brazilian people. Before going further into the work of Tarsila, I would like to make some introduction and some contextualization regarding the Afro-Brazilian culture and the whole problem of race, which was really present and is still really present in Brazilian society. From the 19th to the 20th centuries, the development of Afro-Brazilian identity was mostly linked to the cultural and spiritual practices in Bahia, highly influenced by the African diaspora. After Brazil's independence from Portugal and its declaration as a republic in 1889, the elites held a longing for civilization and progress and considered Europe as a cultural and economic model. With the purpose of whitening the country, there was a substantial arrival of European immigrants in different areas of Brazil, but not so much in Bahia. Considering the late abolition of slavery in 1888, the traces of slave labor was still present in society. Free and freed descendants of slaves still suffered various types of discrimination and struggled to make a living. As a form of resistance, many Afro-Brazilians joined religious traditions such as candomblé and engaged in a martial arts practice known as capoeira. Candomblé was particularly seen as a backward religion by the conservative and white upper classes in Bahia and as supposed impediment to the economic prosperity. The elites and the government have always repressed Afro-Bahian cultural manifestation, reinforcing the presumption of Black culture as inferior. As an example, anthropologist and Dr. Raimundo Nina Rodrigues was one of the pioneers of study of African culture, especially Candomblé. Nina Rodrigues contributed greatly to the research of race and Black culture, focusing on the effects of the Afro-Brazilian population and the increasing miscegenation on the modernization of Brazil. When reflecting on Candomblé artifacts created by the Black settlers, Nina Rodrigues recognized them as works of art instead of just ethnographic objects. Such an approach was groundbreaking at the time because Afro-Brazilian artifacts were not usually examined within the scope of art history. Nina Rodrigues often engaged in detailed descriptions of the work and provided extensive information on their religious origins. However, he maintained a similar discourse of many Brazilian scholars of European descent. According to Nina Rodrigues, Afro-Brazilian art could only be enhanced through a direct contact with Western artistic techniques. In a contemporary light, we can conclude that Nina Rodrigues' racist attitude towards Afro-Brazilian people and culture has somehow validated many current preconceived notions about the argued inferiority of Black settlers in Brazil. Another really important intellectual and artist was Manuel Querino, who was an Afro-Brazilian who challenged the disseminated idea of scientific racism among national scholars. He emphasized the importance of the African contribution to the formation of Brazil. And he analyzed the crucial role of Africans in Brazil's development and had an approach to Afro-Brazilian culture, considering the artists in Bahia. In his books, Querino developed a vast database of artists, craftsmen, architects, and other creative professionals in Bahia as a means of promoting Afro-Brazilian culture. He presented an almost encyclopedic selection of artworks, while arguing that enslaved Africans already held artistic abilities long before the European colonizations, and such technical skills were later explored by the colonizers in the Americas. Bahia was a center for Afro-Brazilian art, and some pieces were imported from African countries, but most of them were already being produced in Brazil. As one of his examples in one of his books, he mentioned works of Afro-Brazilians within the social-political context in Bahia. And he then raised special attention to the relations between Black artists and intellectual labor. Unlike Nina Rodrigues, Querino included full-length biographies of the artists in his books, establishing a proper framework of artistic production in the region and a recognition of Afro-Brazilians as active cultural agents. And Querino's academic approach contributed to a proper identification of Black artists in Bahia. He mentioned the sculptures of Bahian artist Euripides Américo de Araújo Lopes, which depict women street vendors carved in wood, entitled Tipos Baianos de Rua, or Bahian Types on the Street, and the sculptures allude to visual elements of Afro-Brazilian religious artifacts and depict Black women as street vendors, one of the few occupations available to African descendants after the abolition. Another artist that Querino mentioned in his books was the Black artist Benedito José Tobias, whose work remains little known in Brazil. And the undated piece, Porta da Policlínica, Clinic Door, for instance, depicts an ordinary scene of a mother and her daily struggles to raise her children. The portrayal of the Black woman in this painting, holding her two infants on the steps of a clinic, is not stereotyped or used as a representation of Brazilianness. Now coming back to A Negra, despite its vast and diverse production between the 19th and 20th centuries, Afro-Brazilian culture has remained largely unseen. Most Black artists from that period have not received public recognition, and many of their works are still unknown. The lack of proper opportunities for African descendants in Brazil after the abolition has shaped the relationships between the Black people and a mostly white elite. And I would say that there are relationships marked by a paternalist system. In the context of the making of a Negra, there has been much attention given to Tarsila's appropriation of Afro-Brazilian culture in order to create an authentic Brazilian modern art. However, I would like to question the social relations that underpin her portrayal of the Black woman. According to Tarsila, the development of the piece was tied to her own childhood memory and her living in her family's coffee farm. According, in the words of Tarsila, she said, "I want to be the painter of my country. I am so thankful to have spent my whole childhood on the fazenda, which means farm. I don't know why on the book the translation kept the original word in Portuguese. My memories of that time have grown precious to me." The emotional attachment held by Tarsila has created a narrative of nostalgia towards her past experience on the farm located in the countryside. In her own words, during an interview in 1972, one of the most successful paintings I exhibited in Europe is called the Negra, because I have recurring memories of having seen one of those old female slaves when I was 5 or 6 years old, you know. A female slave lived on our fazenda, and she had droppy lips and enormous breasts because I was later told in those days, Black women used to tie rocks to their breasts in order to lengthen them. And then they would sling them back over their shoulders to breastfeed the children they were carrying on their backs. Some scholars believe that a female slave that Tarsila has referred to in her statement is portrayed in an anonymous photograph found in her personal archives. The picture shows a Black woman dressed in white sitting on the stairs. The position of her arms, her abundant breasts, and her passive eye stare are some of the many elements that evoke the figure depicted in A Negra. Tarsila's personal memory of the Black woman reinforces complex social dynamics of the time, especially the underlying relationships between female slaves and their white masters. Enslaved African women were extensively deemed as mães pretas or Black mothers because of their nurturing status in private households. The Black mother was primarily a wet nurse who was responsible for nursing the children of their masters. The use of wet nurses in colonial households was supposedly due to the inability of the white women to nurse their children in the tropical heat of Brazil. Therefore, Black women were seen as more suitable to produce breast milk for the white children because they could handle warm temperatures similar to those of the African continent. Owning a wet nurse was a symbol of prestige for the upper classes in the late 19th century. Despite the abolition and the decreasing use of wet nurses, the existence of Black mothers in Brazilian households was still prevalent in the early 1900s. Nonetheless, in the years following abolition, the role of the Black wet nurses became somewhat unclear within the domestic space. They became no longer part of traditional family portraits, but were still widely depicted by Brazilian writers, artists, and intellectuals. Tarsila immersed herself in nostalgia as a means of finding and embracing her own account of Brazilianness within the anthropophagic movement. Tarsila's intentions were demonstrated through an act of idealization of the Black woman. The artist kept an emotional record of the Black female slave as a caring, nurturing, and tender woman who was part of the uncivilized countryside. Those virtues were mostly associated with a preconceived notion of the Afro-Brazilian woman as a warm and mythical figure. Tarsila and other modernist artists, mostly white and part of an elite, were eager to transmit such affectionate memories through their artworks and portray Black individuals as the authentic representations of the Brazilian people. I would argue that the intentions behind the works were related to an urge to make up for the past in the sense that it combined mixed feelings of gratitude and resentment. Even though the Black woman is depicted by Tarsila in a possible attempt to appreciate and celebrate the Afro-Brazilian peoples, I would wonder whether such portrayal might have only overshadowed other relevant debates or even mitigated racial issues that still prevail in contemporary Brazil. Tarsila and other modernist artists have indeed decided to elect Black people as representatives of their country. However, has such representation actually contributed to the inclusion of the Black community in contemporary Brazilian society? At a time when slavery had just been abolished, Tarsila's intentions as a modernist artist and the painting A Negra denoted much more than a wistful memory. The development of A Negra was highly influenced by European trends of the time, such as all the anthropophagic movement works had this influence, especially Cubism. Tarsila's relationship with the Swiss poet Blaise Cendrars facilitated her encounter with Cubism in Paris in the early 20s. Cendrars came to Brazil in 1924 and worked on his celebrated travelogue, Feuille de Route, Road Maps, whose cover is a drawing version of the painting A Negra. His decision to include A Negra as the cover of his book of poems is extremely symbolic. It represented Brazil in the eyes of the European traveler in search for the exotic and primitive. After Feuille de Route, A Negra became widely famous in Europe, and its image was soon associated with an authentic Brazilian identity. Brancusi's Cendrars introduced Tarsila in 1923 to Romanian sculptor Constantin Brancusi. Many scholars have already argued that Tarsila had probably deployed Brancusi's 1923 piece entitled La Négresse Blanche as a point of departure for her A Negra. The visual similarity between A Negra and La Négresse Blanche is evident. The thickness of the lips and the round form of the bald heads of both figures emphasize the artist's depiction of a quite peculiar and unfamiliar subject. In the words of scholar Rafael Cardoso, with its cartoonish mouth, flattened nose, absence of ears or hair, her face approximates itself to a mask, linking it to the fashion for representing primitive artifacts in Cubism and Expressionism, as well as to the magical and mythical level of symbolism inherent to masks as ritual objects. Brancusi's La Négresse Blanche is positioned on a plinth and is represented as a bust without a human body, whereas Tarsila's A Negra is featured alongside colorful abstractions that resemble a figurative banana leaf. The background of A Negra inserts the female figure in a natural and wild environment, which is a possible allusion to the uncivilized. A Negra's formal resemblance to La Négresse Blanche just reinforces an ambiguity in Tarsila's representation of the Black woman. I would argue that A Negra is such a controversial image because it is not easily located within Afro-Brazilian culture and identity. There is no immediate dialogue with the Afro-Brazilian in the painting. The portrayed Black woman does not have an identity, and even if there were genuine efforts to embrace the Brazilian peoples, Tarsila decided to depict the stereotyped Black woman, servant, domestic, and discriminated by a society marked by slavery. On a different note, it is interesting to observe that Tarsila first showed A Negra in an exhibition at Galerie Percier in Paris in 1926, instead of at a Brazilian museum or gallery. The Paris exhibition was well received by European critics. However, when Tarsila had her first solo exhibition in Brazil in 1929, she decided not to include A Negra in the selection of the showcased works. A Negra was finally shown as part of a group exhibition at the 1939 May Salon in São Paulo, in which Brazilian writers praised the painting for its true representation of the anthropophagic movement in Brazil. Such optimistic responses at the time may evidence how relevant issues, especially racial inequalities due to colonization, had not been properly discussed or were not yet even apparent. However, Tarsila's personal decision for delaying the exhibition of A Negra in Brazil still remains a subject for debate. More recently, in 2019, the Museum of Art of São Paulo organized the exhibition Tarsila Popular, as an allusion to the fact that she's one of the most well-known Brazilian artists in Brazil and worldwide, as well as to the fact that her paintings have resonated with the mass society due to her depictions of the everyday people and workers in Brazil in a later stage of her career. However, in one of the rooms, we could see a Negra positioned between two self-portraits by Tarsila, and at the same time that the curators wanted to share the formal similarities between them, since the three of them were portraits of women, we can't help but imagine that once again a Negra's real identity is oppressed. She is between the two paintings of a white and wealthy woman, as if she was still part of this complex domestic and paternalist dynamic. This could have been an amazing opportunity to go further into the discussion about her identity as an Afro-Brazilian woman. So it is possible to conclude that A Negra is much more than an iconic painting by a key modernist artist of the anthropophagic movement in Brazil. Aside from its formalist qualities, A Negra underlies a brutal history, one that is still present in Brazil. Even though it is not possible to safely confirm that Tarsila was totally aware of such issues when developing the piece, the desire of the artist to create a modern and civilized art could have normalized and outshined visible social inequalities. Despite Tarsila's possible intention to empower Black people, there is nevertheless an endorsement of the exoticizing gaze in the work, which exemplifies yet another case of Black otherness. Most notably, A Negra should not be forgotten as an artwork belonging to the past, but an archetype that must be constantly challenged. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, for that rich and fascinating presentation. All questions for Caroline's research will be addressed following our next presentation. And at this time, I would like to invite Gwen to join us on the screen to share her presentation titled Icon of the Hero, Tracing the Expression of Citizenship and Nationalism Through Representation of Simón Bolívar in South America to José Martí and Che Guevara in Cuba. Thank you, Gwen.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, and thank you, Caroline, for a wonderful presentation, and to everyone who presented yesterday. It was fascinating to hear everyone's talks. I will just share my screen. Just a moment. So my paper is titled Icon of the Hero, Tracing the Expression of Citizenship and Nationalism Through Representations of Simón Bolívar in South America and José Martí and Guevara in Cuba. Before the image of the hero emerged in Latin American nations' struggle for independence from colonial Spain, the image of the king was the prominent icon in artistic practices and cultural traditions. Natalia Malouf's extensive research has shown that the image of the king was a physical manifestation of authority in colonial Latin America, which was distributed and circulated throughout the New World as a form of placeholding for the royal figure himself. Building on the work of Malouf and Emily Engel on vice-regal portraiture, I analyzed how portraits of heroes in post-colonial Latin America were manipulated, aligning their subjects with abstract ideals of the nation and co-opting visual strategies of power from royal portraiture. In particular, I focus on two works of art, Portrait of Simón Bolívar from 1823 by José Gil de Castro and Rosas y Estrellas from 1972 by Raúl Martínez. These works are separated by 150 years, but as I discuss, each puts forth a calculated, heroic representation of its subject that reflected specific socio-political ideologies of the time. Iconographies of the hero were stabilizing factors in periods of socio-political transition and potential uncertainty, as exemplified in the use of images of Bolívar, Martí, and Guevara. These portraits, while painted by Gil de Castro and Martínez, are more akin to products of compromise between the artists and their subjects. Rather than simply a mere reflection of a historical figure, each portrait demonstrates an imaginary hero inflected by regional, temporal, and social contexts and aspirations. Gil de Castro's paintings of Simón Bolívar emerge from traditions of viceregal portraiture, yet play with flattening and Republican motifs to create an image of Bolívar as a modern mestizo Pan-American liberator. Similarly, in the work of Martinez, I explore how his portrayals of José Martí and Che Guevara as local Cuban heroes exemplify the average mixed-race man and affirm the Cuban Revolution as a peasant guerrilla struggle against an institutional bourgeois elite. These two works mobilized heroes as icons under which new republics established a conception of citizenship based in masculinity and whiteness. The constructions of heroism in these works align with Nicholas Mirzov's analysis of the visuality of the hero, who has the ability to see beyond the present into history. Bolívar and Martí composed personal representations that establish themselves as virtuous heroes, properly masculine, capable of work, both on the battlefield and in Congress. This portrait by El Libertador by José Gil de Castro was likely the first of 3 works commissioned by Bolívar himself. He was so pleased with the likeness that he in fact commissioned Gil de Castro to make 10 copies of this bust portrait to be placed in public and government spaces in Peru, some of which are shown here. A locally trained Peruvian painter, Gil de Castro painted the Viceregal Society of Santiago, Chile, before moving on to independence heroes while in the Chilean army. In this portrait by Gil de Castro, Bolívar sits upright with focus squarely on his face. While his military garb is on full display, the gold epaulets and glistening leaves on his chest are not overstated or ostentatious. Rather, they demonstrate a man of stature, a man of clear military prowess. Bolívar stares at us, his eyes wide, eyebrows raised, with a stern expression that almost questions our presence. His gaze here, all-knowing and all-seeing, reminds us of Mirzov's hero, whose gaze, quote, petrifies the transformations of modernity into recognizable social relations, end quote. Bolívar's appearance here is of someone with darkened skin, his features brown and black, creating an ambiguous phenotypical presence that hints at mixed ancestry. His hair, unruly, is painted with a deft, soft touch by Gil de Castro, and his skin, while smooth, has lines from age and experience. These details continue in the various copies of the portrait Gil de Castro made. Now, consider what this image actually tells us about its subject. What was the real identity of Bolívar? This avenue of study has been discussed by historians for decades due to such a varied and inconclusive iconography, leaving the exact likeness of El Libertador unknown to this day. I focus on the phenotypical aspect of representations of Bolívar because Gil de Castro's painting is not the only one to present him as mixed. There were many rumors of Bolívar having African heritage, which scholars like Stephen Hart and Enrique Uribe White have dismissed as false. Scholars mostly attribute his rough exterior to having spent time on the battlefield in the sun, weathered by war. Hart explains that these rumors likely gained traction with artists, quote, wishing to co-opt the recently freed slaves of the subcontinent to Bolívar's cause, end quote. Historically, Bolívar was in fact a phenotypically white member of Venezuela's Spanish-descended elite. His family had made their fortune through the encomienda, mines and plantations, with Bolívar himself having received plantations and slaves as baptismal gifts as a child. Similar to other portraits of Bolívar by Gil de Castro, the main focus of this portrait is his military authority. In the subsequent full-body portraits from 1825 and 1826 to 1830, Gil de Castro presents Bolívar in full military garb, his stance proud, mimicking the bust portrait with the bent arm tucked into his lapel. In each of these works, Bolívar stands alone on a checkered floor, either with his sword and uniform alone, or by a desk with pens, encapsulates that muscled corporeality of a military man. Instead, we see a skinny figure whose head seems larger than life. Gil de Castro's ability to direct focus to Bolívar's face points to the importance of noting Bolívar as a military leader capable of intellectual labor beyond the battlefield. These portraits continue the model of the Napoleonic portrait, mixing the haughty and mixing the royal and the militaristic. In particular, the hand tucked into the left lapel and the, quote, haughty glare directed downwards at the viewer, and, quote, recalls Jacques-Louis David's famous painting, The Emperor Napoleon in his study at the Tuileries, shown here. Bolívar, to be sure, felt the influence of Napoleon in his time spent in Europe in his youth. Much like Napoleon himself became a king-like symbol in body and title, Bolívar fashioned himself as the face of the independence movement. Bolívar's focus on national republican ideals is demonstrated through his continued representation always in military dress, rather than any kind of imperial regalia. The continued emphasis on Bolívar as a military figure in his representation points to his right to rule through his military exploits and political leadership, and I believe solidifies a link between citizenship and military service, particularly through the conception of virtue. Sarah Chambers' work has established how Bolívar's form of republicanism was an ode to ancient Greece and Rome, as well as the principles of Rousseau. This model was steeped in military values, with Bolívar constantly making note of honor and virtue and the necessity of, quote, the formation of proper men as virtuous citizens, and, quote, on the model of the soldier who embodied valor, desprendimiento, patriotismo, actividad, celo y talento militar. As Chambers attests, Bolívar's conception of a true republic was based in the public liberty of white men, subordinating the other, but also in a subordination of the self to the republic. Self-sacrifice for the sake of the nation was the only truly virtuous path to citizenship. What makes these portraits by Gil de Castro so fascinating is their alignment with Bolívar's perception of himself and the image he so carefully crafted. I argue that these portraits, in particular the bust portrait from 1823, are in fact products created from dialogue between artist and sitter, both active and implicit. Bolívar's control of his image and how it was received constructed himself as an ideal griotro leader capable of ushering in a unified Pan America. He supported, managed, and manipulated his representation by Gil de Castro, regardless of its veracity. There is record of Bolívar's partiality in images, two images of himself by Gil de Castro, and he often claimed it as his most like his natural image. In sending this 1825 portrait to London ally Colonel Wilson, he wrote, "Portrait made from life in Lima with the greatest exactitude and likeness." In fact, he sent this portrait to England for the express purpose of having an engraving made from its likeness. The resulting print by Charles Turner, shown here, was then disseminated throughout Europe, another instance of Bolívar using Gil de Castro's composition and representation of himself for promotional purposes. As I touched on before, I believe that rumors of Bolívar's supposed African descent were co-opted and deployed purposefully in representations of him as ambiguously raced in order to solidify Bolívar's reputation and acceptance as the liberator. Positioning himself as a descendant of indigenous and African peoples, Bolívar crafted a compelling myth that situated him as the perfect representation of a mixed griotro nation. In reality, his attitude towards Afro-descendant peoples was one of cautious suspicion. While he viewed abolition as a key element to creating a republic, he viewed the growing Black and Pardo populations as a threat to unity and continued rule by griotro elites. It is important to note that his approach to emancipation was linked to military success. He freed slaves in Venezuela in return for Haitian aid and only into military service. By giving their physical bodies to the Republican struggle, slaves would achieve freedom and virtue and thus become worthy of citizenship to the new nation. Bolívar viewed emancipation as a necessary and strategic tool for controlling popular opinion, which he reinforced in his championing of a new hybrid national identity, which at once unified and superseded all racial divisions. Stefan Palmier argues that it is in Bolívar's address to the Congress at Angostura in 1819, where notions of heterogeneity and hybridity become tied to criollismo. In this speech, the liberator contested, We are not Europeans, we are not Indians, we are but a mixed species of Aborigines and Spaniards, Americans by birth and Europeans by law. We find ourselves engaged in a dual conflict. We are disputing with the natives for titles of ownership, and at the same time, we are struggling to maintain ourselves in the country that gave us birth against the opposition of the invaders, end quote. Bolívar's claim to legitimacy of rule was also supported by this self-representation as a symbolic hero of the people, a hero who exhibited a little bit of every contingent of society. In reality, the truth of the likeness of Bolívar does not matter in this context. Instead, we see a subject seeking control over his representation and an artist who, possibly for the sake of parallel association or because he bought into the myth of Bolívar, facilitated this fiction. Beyond his presentation of himself to the public and through his actions, it is almost certain that Bolívar was an active participant in the painting process alongside the artist. Through her extensive research into the provenance and making of this work, Natalia Malyouf asserts that we can assume that, quote, Bolívar had an active participation in the painter's decisions regarding each of the details in these portraits that could be classified as strategic, end quote. Even Gil de Castro's signature on this portrait ties into claims to citizenship. It reads, in Lima, por el ciudadano José Gil, capitán del cuerpo de ingenieros y primer retratista. At once, Gil de Castro points to his position in the army, his status as an artist, and his claim to citizenship, and also situates Bolívar as the leader of Peru. I contend that in this case, Gil de Castro's portraits of Bolívar exist as sites of mediation between various claims to representation. Similar to Bolivarian iconography, images of José Martí have been widely circulated and mobilized throughout Cuba since his lifetime. In fact, Martí's fame amassed mostly after his death, with the legend surrounding his patriotic actions and heroic death in battle spreading across the island faster than his writing. Like Bolívar, Martí stressed self-sacrifice in the name of the Republic and championed virtue as the basis for an ideal citizenry. I focus on a painting made more than 50 years after his death, Rosas y Estrellas by Raúl Martínez, because it demonstrates not only Martí's legacy, but also its inflection on his image and those who activate him as an icon. Only one painting of Martí exists from his lifetime, this portrait by Herman Norman, made from life in 1891. Here we see Martí the intellectual, the statesman who spent most of his life campaigning for Cuban independence in New York and Florida, rallying Cubans in the diaspora to fight imperialism. This portrait stands in line with the reputation Martí created for himself during his lifetime, particularly through his representation and literary works. While only this painting exists, there are hundreds of extant photographs of Martí, but in groups, as shown here, by himself, with his family, in his office, on political missions, etc. What is so striking about the many, many photographs of Martí is the consistency between them all. In each, Martí appears stoic, posed here with his arms crossed, as if deep in thought. And here, this portrait of him in Jamaica from 1892, he stands similarly pensive, arms drawn behind him, almost as if he has been interrupted mid-pace, considering the heavy task ahead of him. In every image, Martí is serious, wearing, quote, his warm black suit and white collar, always looking directly and earnestly into the camera and never, ever smiling, end quote. Even when there is a tiny hint of a smile, even when he is photographed with his family or with children, he never drops this visage of the solemn statesman. I contend that these photos, like the painting by Norman, are all products of a meticulous construction and manipulation by Martí of his own image in order to represent a specific ideal. Similar to Bolívar's control over his representation, Martí exhibited a particularly shrewd command over his own. Interestingly, photographs of Martí, according to Alfred Lopez, contrasts, quote, starkly with his widely acknowledged reputation as a magnetic, charismatic leader and advocate of the revolution, end quote. Martí, while in person a gregarious, outspoken leader who could rouse with his speech, consistently portrayed himself as a taciturn, patient scholar, which Lopez claims stemmed directly from, quote, his own careful self-manipulation, an effort that reveals his awareness of the importance of cultivating his image, not only for the present moment, but for posterity as well, end quote. Concerned beyond his present struggle of independence, Martí considered himself and his image symbols that would save Cuba against the tide of imperialism. Martí consciously constructed an image that would parallel his written work, both working hand in hand to present him as the patriotic statesman. This image continued to be propagated after his death, along with new images of him as a martyr killed on the battlefield, such as this 1917 painting by Esteban Valderrama. It is important to note that Martí's greatest influence in Cuba and on the independence struggle remained through his writing, as he spent very little time on the battlefield. His mightiest sword was always the pen, yet his choice to go to battle reveals both a desire for heroism and a vanity of self-importance in his ability to physically fight in the struggle. This final act had as much a part to play in the construction of his image as did his posing in masquerade for the camera. His careful control of his image in life and in death continues to have relevance in how he is represented years into the future, mostly because these representations are all taken from images of him taken in his lifetime. Even beyond the grave, Martí manages to continue control over his legacy through the tireless tailoring and posing he engaged in his lifetime and his selfless martyrdom, which in turn led to a legacy of virtue and heroism. More links Martí to Bolívar than a control over self-image. Parallels between the two were mobilized consciously by Martí in order to position himself as a natural successor to Bolívar's legacy. Here we see statues of both figures created in the same year, showing each in a military style on horseback. At a celebration of Bolívar's 110th birthday in New York, Martí stated, quote, Cubans will always think of Bolívar arranging with Sucre the expedition which never arrived to free Cuba, end quote. Thus, he linked Cuba's fight for independence as a natural progression of Bolívar's independence campaign some 80 years earlier. Martí's rhetoric also connects to Bolívar, such as his title of true revolutionary for the liberator, as well as his many evocations of virtue and patriotism in his writing. Privately, in correspondence with others fighting for independence, Martí stressed the importance of revolution leaders to not just be strong, but to, quote, appear strong in the eyes of the Cuban people, end quote. The importance of the appearance of heroism from Martí paralleled Bolívar's constant appearance in military garb, and in the many instances he linked virtue and heroism on the battlefield to his national authority. This, alongside Martí's final act of patriotism on the battlefield, creates another parallel to Bolívar in the conception of military action as necessary to heroic service and as a precursor to acquiring citizenship in the new nation. Like Bolívar, Martí was also concerned with unifying the Cuban public after independence and achieving a harmonious union amongst the different strata of Cuban society. While Bolívar had liberated South America, white Cubans of Spanish descent had chosen to remain loyal to the crown and the established plantation economy. Non-white peoples on the island in many ways saw independence as a means to more freedom, particularly through the example of Afro-Cuban military heroes like Antonio Maceo. In order to galvanize support for the independence cause from both camps, Martí utilized the concept of mestizaje as a unifying methodology, and in this sense, he brought in Bolívar's ideal of a Pan-America into a more utopian, multiracial Latin American identity, which all could claim. Similar to Bolívar's stance on race, Martí's mobilization of mestizaje became a blank identifying term that negated any kind of racial division in the name of unity. In his famous text, Nuestra América from 1891, Martí proudly proclaimed, quote, there is no racial hatred because there are no races, end quote. He continued this point 2 years later in the text Mi Raza, stating, man means more than white, more than mulatto, more than negro. Cuban means more than white, more than mulatto, more than negro. On the battlefields, the souls of whites and blacks who died for Cuba have risen together through the air, end quote. In his mention of the battlefield, Martí, like Bolívar, also qualified military service as a site of integration. Virtue for both revolutionaries was something gained on the battlefield. Playing to a divided populace, Martí pointed to the benefit of enlisting Afro-Cuban soldiers to white leaders, while also pointing out the potential for individual distinction and stature to Afro-Cubans. And it was on the battlefield in his martyrdom that Martí truly fulfilled the role of virtuous patriot that he constructed in his image. Returning to Raúl Martínez's Rosas y Estrellas, we can understand how the impact of Martí's manipulation of his representation carried far beyond his death, and how his image was further mobilized by those interested in co-opting him as an icon for their own purposes. In reality, Martí's image was not so widely circulated across Cuba until Batista came into power, and he mobilized Martí as the father of the Cuban nation, as did Fidel Castro after the 1959 revolution. Castro not only took great pains to place himself with Martí in photographs, but he positioned Martí as the figurehead of the 1959 revolution, naming him the ideological origin of the revolution. In effect, legitimizing himself and the revolution as a continuation of Martí's struggle for independence. He expanded this analogy further by recruiting Cuban artists to construct visual thematic linkages to Martí as well as to Bolívar. Raúl Martínez, one of the most famous Cuban pop artists, was key in this campaign to create a visual discourse of the revolution that would translate and battle imperialism abroad, marking Cuba as a model of ongoing anti-colonialist struggle. In her examination of Cuban posters, Lisa Corrigan has attested that the iconography used by Martínez, quote, asserted a new masculine identity for the island, which reconstituted Cuba as a strong nation of new men who could withstand and flourish in the face of American dominance, end quote. Martínez's work was so popular and influential because of how well it not just relayed imagery, but also personified ideals of the revolution. Artists at this time were deputized with educating Cubans and establishing icons for the populace to aspire to, like the subjects of Rosas y Estrellas. Here, the collective heroes of Cuban independence surround José Martí, the father of La Patria, at center. From left to right, we see Simón Bolívar, Fidel Castro, Camilo Cienfuegos, José Martí, Máximo Gómez, Che Guevara, and Antonio Maceo. By visually uniting these heroes from different times, Martínez expressed a lineage of struggle from Bolivarian independence to the Cuban Revolution. Martí and Che also both hold white roses, the purity of the white lying stark against the colors of the portrait, mainly of the red and blues of the Cuban flag, complete with a white star from the flag as well, thus proving the virtue of the revolutionary cause. The white roses also nod to Martí's poem, Cultivo una rosa blanca, where he likens La Patria, or the homeland, to a white rose which needs tending. Another pivotal aspect of Martínez's work was his ability to create the feel of the everyman in his paintings, and to create a visual discourse that related these icons of independence, these heroes, to everyday Cubans and their part in the independence struggle. Martínez promoted a sense of the everyman in his portraits of Cuban heroes who became symbols of a Pan-American identity. These images were distributed via posters and print across the world in attempts to bring other nations in solidarity with the Cuban revolution, or what Gerardo Mosquera has called, quote, neo-Bolivaresque dreams, unquote. The image of the everyman through the hero in Cuban painting is also tied to Che Guevara's conception of the new man, or the guerrillero. Guevara and Castro's emphasis on the new man and the humanism inherent in its conception of Cuban identity was articulated visually in the symbol of Martí and to affect Guevara and Castro themselves. Martínez particularly took the hypermasculine discourse of the Cuban Revolution and articulated it through the images of Martí, Castro, and Guevara as examples that encapsulated the virility of Cubanness. In Martí La Estrella from 1966, Martinez gives us 12 iterations of Martí, each one connected to the Cuban flag through red, white, and blue triangles in the background and bright stars in the foreground. However, no matter the subtle differences of each face, in each of these images we see a patriotic Martí, a virtuous Martí. Similarly, in Phoenix from 1968, we see 9 versions of Che in his guerrillero beard and beret as a modern father of America. Created after Guevara's death in Bolivia in 1967, in this work, Martinez shrewdly used pop aesthetics and structure to parallel Guevara and his personal sacrifice to the abstract concept of America. In the many similarities between these works, Martinez parallels Martí and Guevara while also subtly pointing to the martyrdom of both actors on the part of freedom efforts. Phoenix demonstrates the martyrdom of Guevara even in its title. Che is a phoenix rising from the ashes of guerrilla struggle. His image is repeated 9 times with what appear to be microphones in front of each, designating him the spokesman and symbol for the revolutionary agenda. Martinez also adds the words Che America to the piece, thus instilling the Cuban Revolution with the spirit of America or the Pan-Americanism of Bolívar. Similar to Gil de Castro, Martinez used a familiar convention of visual rhetoric in his creation of these images, but also instituted breaks from convention. He used a figurative style in order to increase accessibility to the messages in his work, using easily recognizable images of Martí and Guevara that allowed the Cuban public to identify each individual character. Yet, through his creation of a pop aesthetic, Martinez imbued stoicism and martyrdom in the characters, placing them carefully next to symbols of the flower, or la patria, fire, radical change, and the star, patriotism. He created a revolutionary aesthetic that aligned with the revolutionary cause. The characters in Rosas y Estrellas are presented as examples of the new man, some before their time. Similar also to Gil de Castro, in this work, the use of darkened oranges and browns gives the subjects a simultaneously flattened image and ambiguity. From these images, we cannot tell the race of these men clearly, but they do seem to be phenotypically darker, possibly a call to Martí's emphasis on mestizaje. I view Rosas y Estrellas as a cumulative collective creation, an image fusing the input of Bolívar, Gil de Castro, Martí, Guevara, and Castro. Each had their say in elements of self-representation in this image, creating their ideal new nation that moved beyond the bounds of what had constrained each. In this painting, Bolívar continues to wear his military garb and mustache, while Martí continues in his crossed arms, this time filled with white floral imagery and green grass that emanates like fire. In analyzing the multiple active and passive participatory elements creating this image, we can understand further how the legacy of these hero figures enabled the representations to become icons, developing a specific iconography of the Latin American hero. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. That was so fascinating, especially in relation to the public curation of identity and how a sitter might be viewed. So we are now going to open up the Q&A portion for both Gwen and Caroline. And I think there's already a question in the box. And so, Caroline, could you discuss the background of a Negra more? Are the colors suggestive of or symbolic of the culture? Is a blanket or some other cultural element being consciously evoked here?
Thank you for the question. Thank you, Gwen, for your wonderful presentation. That's really interesting because when we are discussing a Negra, and all the scholars always give more attention to the figure itself, but from what has been researched about the background, it's really not immediately identifiable with Brazilian cultural elements, or even just immediate Brazilian, like really in specific Brazilian culture. It is more Tarsila trying to convey a message regarding Cubist elements. I think that's the most yeah, the explanation that we find from the background of the painting, that's another issue about it. The only thing that could be more related to the whole Brazilian culture and the tropical and the anthropophagic movement would be the sign that it seems to be a banana leaf, and that was also drawn in the Feuille de Route book. So that's the only elements that we can identify as a message or something related to the Brazilian culture.
Thank you. The next question is for Gwen, and it says, thank you for your interesting paper. Could you speak to the overlap here of portraiture and propaganda and how this was accepted or viewed by the citizens?
Sure. I mean, I think the basis of my paper is basically that portraiture and propaganda at this time are inextricably linked, and that there is no thinking one without the other. And you see this in both kind of situations with Bolivar, in that even Bolivar's contemporaries who weren't exactly great fans of him would still display portraits of him because they knew that it would give them some kind of currency in the new social sphere. Also, you know, Bolivar, there are lots of independence heroes, but Bolivar's face is the one that appears again and again and again. He's also the one who starts to appear on actual money, on currency at this time. And similarly with José Martí is such an interesting case in Cuba because he's loved by Cubans no matter what political leaning. So he is taken as a symbol and co-opted by very conservative Cuban Americans in Florida and in New York. He's taken as a symbol, you know, of anti-Castroism, anti-communism, and then in Cuba he's taken as this lead and as this, you know, ideological origin, as this father of La Patria and this father of the revolution. He's extolled by the government, he's extolled by dissidents to the government all throughout the island. So he has become this symbol of Cuban patriotism that is so widely spread and used that it's very fascinating.
Thank you. I actually have a question going off of that a little bit, and especially in your discussion of Martí and his carefully curated identity as a statesman. And you brought in those photographs because there's lack of portraiture of him, but I was just wondering, especially the one of the child, it looks so much like it belongs within the familial or just domestic sphere. And so are these retrospectively curating his identity, or how well known these photographs would have been at the time they were taken? Really just how these help to contribute more to his identity.
So these are all taken during his lifetime, and the thing is that there are books of images of Martí, and he's not smiling in a single one of them. And that's what's so fascinating, is that he's so clearly invested in how he presents himself in images, and that he's constantly a statesman. He's constantly being shown as this presentation, right, as this physical manifestation of the independence movement. But whether or not his images, I mean, what we find is that his images are more widely distributed after he dies because of this, you know, martyrdom, because of this self-sacrifice, because he decides ultimately, I can no longer write anymore, I must go fight on the battlefield. And he's killed pretty much instantly because, you know, clearly he's not a soldier. He does not know how to fight. He just feels he needs to. And that's what I'm arguing, is that action is as much a careful construction of his image. And that it's like this myth, this idea of, oh, this man, you know, left his security in the United States. He traveled across to Cuba from Florida, you know, in a small rowboat. He got here to the battlefield and he risked his life and sacrificed his life. That kind of myth starts to emerge across the island before his image ever does. And after he dies, his image becomes part of this kind of propaganda for the independence struggle. He becomes, they say, you know, Martí died, he gave his life for this. you must give your life for it too. You know, you must support us. His image, which is then taken usually from some kind of an artist rendering of a photo, or a photo that they have then taken, you know, and put up with a Cuban flag. There's a couple different instances of it. So it's construction during his lifetime, but also construction by people after he dies.
Thank you. This question is for Caroline. What relationship do you see between Tarsila's work and the relationship of the indigenous people of Brazil, especially in relationship to the notion of primitivism?
Yeah, with the indigenous people, I could see that she has not, regarding a Negra, I could not see that there's a direct relation to the indigenous people, but I could see like other works by her that she had explored the indigenous people and the whole countryside idea of the indigenous people and the urban environment. I think that that's the most direct connection that we can do in her work within related to indigenous people. But yes, I don't think that Tarsila had actually explored so much the idea of Brazilianness, so much specifically to indigenous people, although she puts a lot of the idea of the tropical and the anthropophagic movement being all related to the tropical idea of Brazil, of this warm country, of this really primitive or even uncivilized. And her relation to primitivism, I could see that it's much more, it's almost a primitivism that is imported from Europe and from the Paris circles and the whole modernist artists in Paris. So I could not also see like a specific relation to primitivism that she developed by herself or by the anthropophagic movement. Is almost a primitivism which is adapted from Paris, from Europe to Brazil and to the anthropophagic movement. Yeah.
Thank you. And then also for Caroline, you mentioned how many Black artists have not received public recognition, and scholarship overlooks this complicated and complex relations of race in Brazil. But I was wondering if you could speak a little more about how Tarsila's archetypal depiction of Black identity compares to her contemporaries during this period, and if we see any kind of this imagery in other works.
Yeah. With the depiction of Black people and other artists being done at the same time, at the same period as Tarsila, we can see that there are a lot of other artists, and especially, again, modernist artists and the form part of a white elite who were trying to portray a sense of Brazilianness and talk about the Black cultures. So yes, I'm sorry, what is the end of the question?
Just how her archetypal depiction, you called it this archetypal, and how this kind of relates to other portrayals of Black identity, and if we see the repetition of her imagery in other artists.
Yeah, with the repetition with other artists, there are actually a lot of other artists who also put the same idea of this archetype, but in Tarsila's work, I could see that that's more immediate, that's more, we can identify that better, because I mentioned some other two artists, Black artists from that same kind of the same period, and their portrayal of the Black identity and the Afro-Brazilian identity had much more this kind of like formal and almost really influenced by the European expressionism, but not so much part of this whole modernist movement in Brazil. So it's quite kind of separate. It's as much as it is as if the Brazilian modernists and the group of modernists that Tarsila was part were portraying a type of Afro-Brazilian identity, of this kind of stereotype, and the Black artists themselves were portraying themselves in another manner. So I could see that that's the kind of dynamics that were happening at that time. And of course, Tarsila became much more well-known and much more famous than the other Black artists who were portraying themselves in a different type and a different manner.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for great presentations and examining identity. this time, if there are no more questions, we'll go ahead and break. I want to remind everybody that we have an extended break today due to the schedule shift. So the last two presentations will take place at their originally scheduled time, and we'll reconvene at 2:45. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you back from our extended break to the final session of the Emerging Scholars Symposium, Visualizing Identity, Exploring Dimensions of the Self Through Art, hosted by the Association of Graduate Art Students and the Georgia Museum of Art. My name is Noah Dassinger, and I'm a first-year master's student at the University of Georgia's Lamar Dodd School of Art. Thank you to my fellow session chairs, Tara Kraft, Francesca Felicella, and Charlotte Gaye for making this symposium a possibility. This final session, in many ways similar to our first session of the day, is devoted to discussing issues related to colonialism, feminism, and racial identity. I would like to thank our presenters and remind everyone to type their questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll return to each question at the end of the session. Our first presenter is Sayantan Mukhopadhyay, presenting his paper entitled At Home in the World, Domesticity in Indian Contemporary Art. Sayantan is a PhD student in art history from the University of California, Los Angeles, where he studies modern and contemporary art. At this time, I would like to invite Sayantan to begin his presentation.
Thank you so much, Noah. And thank you to all of the organizers and to all of you here today, and to those of you in colder climes, sending you some Southern California warmth. So the paper I'm presenting today is derived from the first chapter of my dissertation, which is provisionally titled Of Hearth and Home, Contemporary Art in India, 1980 to 2000. And this chapter traces the broad contours of feminist practice in Indian contemporary art in the last decades of the 20th century, with an eye towards developing connections between three focal artists within my purview, who you see here, Arpita Singh, Nilima Sheikh, and the late Mrinalini Mukherjee. These artists belong to a generation of practitioners who came to prominence together in the 1970s and who were all born around the time of India's independence from British rule in 1947. Though the three artists were lifelong friends, my project will be the first that I know of to triangulate them in an effort to draw out unexpected convergences. I argue in this chapter that these artists express a formal attachment to textile, which they integrate into their work in various media. Textile is used as a visual metaphor that speaks to conceptions of home and domesticity, held in productive tension with those of work, labor, and industry. I'd originally planned to share my thoughts on all three of these artists with you today, but I think to make best use of our time together and to really do justice to these artists and their work, I will focus on the two painters in the group, who are Arpita Singh and Nilima Sheikh, who you see up top. My readings draw on growing scholarship on the conjunction between textiles, contemporary art, and politics. Most notably, Julia Bryan Wilson's recent monograph on the infusion of textiles into contemporary art in the US and in Chile provides me with the theoretical tools for defining the medium's potency. Using methodology indebted to feminist and queer intervention in art history, Bryan Wilson outlines how textile, loaded with its many gendered, racial, and queer valences, allows for radical positions in art making by highlighting what she calls the fray, a term that conveys how fabric, through its very quotidian ordinariness, can expose the undoing or the unraveling of rigid boundaries and hard edges, be they methodological, disciplinary, or taxonomic. The fray then becomes the site where the lines between art and craft, high and low, serious and hobbyist are all blurred. And this fraying, I argue, is evident in the work of these artists I will discuss today, despite their position as painters. I will show that Singh and Sheikh mobilize a metaphor of textile to enact this notion of fraying within their own indigenous setting, mining the binaries of indigeneity and modernity, artist and artisan, private and public. I'll start with Arpita Singh, and I'm just giving you a broad overview of her body of work here. She was born in 1937 in Kolkata and later moved to New Delhi. Singh finished her education at the Delhi Polytechnic School, where she received her diploma in fine arts. But she came to painting by way of a career working in newly formed government agencies that had been charged with cultivating and preserving cultural heritage in a newly independent India. Right around 1947 and into the 50s, the federal government had begun creating support networks for what it saw as essential industries contributing to a national culture. The Weavers Service Center, where Singh had worked, the Weaver Service Center where Singh had worked after completing her degree was set up in 1956 in various cities to help India's booming textile industry, providing expertise to an association of weavers, painters, printers, and dyers on various issues, including documentation practices, technological support, and product development. In this then young government agency, a wing of the Ministry of Textiles, Singh worked closely with Delhi's thriving community of textile makers. Singh showed particular interest in learning about embroidery and studied gatha, a stitch indigenous to her native Bengal. Gatha is a form of freestyle, intricate hand embroidery in which the stitch runs through the entirety of the fabric, covering the cloth in continuous pattern. Complex and multi-stage in its production technique, it is most closely associated with the work of rural women in Bengali villages practiced today on both sides of the border in India and in Bangladesh. This form of embroidery is one of the many diverse influences cited by Singh upon her practice, which further include Tibetan Thangka paintings, Pattachitra scrolls, and the work of Paul Klee and Henri Rousseau, just to name a few. The presence of the stitch, which takes the form of visual elements borrowed from embroidery, is apparent throughout the entirety of her corpus, especially after the experimental abstractions produced during the 1970s that characterized the first decades of her career. The stitch is a form of mark making for Singh, one that allows for a translation between the art of embroidery and that of painting. In the smaller watercolors Singh painted during the 1980s, the artist elicits a fascination with the porosity of interior space. For Singh, the home is not sacred and not entirely immune to the mechanizations of the public sphere. A recurring trope in her images is that of a female protagonist inhabiting a domestic scene into which the outside world curiously and haphazardly bleeds in. This enchantment with the spaces women occupy calls to mind theorizations put forth by scholars of subaltern studies who have interrogated gendered constructions of space in colonial India. In his seminal text, The Nation and Its Fragments, historian Partha Chatterjee argued that colonial India was made up of two gendered worlds, the private and the public. His assessment of gendered subjectivity in Indian society emerged partially in response to Gayatri Spivak's earlier indictment of the Subaltern Studies Collective, citing their failure to account for the subject position of women among subaltern classes and their general lack of interest in naming and recognizing the instrumentality of female subaltern consciousness. As part of her critique, Spivak noted how the feminist historian of subaltern groups must refocus women as a structural rather than marginal issue. It is out of this agonistic discussion that Chatterjee's account of the place of women in anti-colonial nationalism emerged, and in which he located the significance of female agency in the spaces of the home. Chatterjee argues that while the male colonial subject was able to negotiate between the home and the British-dominated sphere of public life, the woman was relegated almost exclusively to the former, that is the home. While men were able to mimic their imperial rulers on the streets and in offices, women were charged with the task of upholding spirituality in the closed quarters of the home. The purveyance of spirituality was understood to be the characteristic that set the colonial subject apart from the colonizer. As a result, women become one of the nation's so-called fragments in Chatterjee's terms, a group that could be appropriated, but that alongside other marginalized communities such as Dalits and peasants could not fully belong. In other words, the close correlation between femininity and the cultivation of private life was something, as Chatterjee argues, located at the very beginnings of a nationalist discourse in colonial Bengal. Chatterjee's formulations allow for a way to understand the gendered legacy of space in the Indian context. In her work, Singh appears to dissect these notions of gendered space, addressing them directly while also affixing the rigidity of the supposed divide. In Through the Wind from 1988, an elderly woman dominates the frame. Notably, the aging and abject female body would emerge as a characteristic preoccupation for Singh throughout the later 80s and the 1990s. In spite of a lack of assured ground, this woman sits in a modified cross-legged pose on a checkered floor with her arms hugging her left leg. In an awkward seated contrapposto, her solemn and weathered face looks out beyond the frame of the painting. She's shrouded in black cloth, yet the surface of her cloak is diaphanous, causing her underlying body and the pink bra she wears to show through. Despite the potential voyeurism that this may allow, her body is bereft of any eroticism. It's ordinary, middle-aged, and presented plainly. Emerging from beneath her skin is the flower pattern that makes up the ground of the image, turning her bodily presence into a haunted form. Clothed and unclothed, present and absent at once, our protagonist remains partially spectral. The space around her swirls with patterns and icons. The black and white tile floor extends to a horizontal point at which we may presume a wall rises, covered in a crude floral pattern. A curtained window, rotated eerily so that it floats freely among the roses, is seemingly ajar, a breeze discernible in the creases of the curtain's pink fabric. A sofa sits at the point where the tiles meet this naive wallpaper, upholstered with another floral motif on the seat cushion. An identical second sofa, rotated in the same axis as the window, is suspended just below. All of these jumbled signifiers work together to establish for the viewer that the woman sits in some otherworldly living room, reconfigured through expressionist abstraction that is drawn up at the same comparison with the paintings of Marc Chagall. The sanctity of the room as an interior space is challenged by a series of objects that have infiltrated it. A small steamboat crosses the floor by the woman's foot, billowing blue gas as it trails along, while two diminutive automobiles ride the line of her black veil. Amidst this industrial imagery, a flock of ducks that scatter across the room are almost camouflaged in the decorative patterning on the wall, but can be discerned sitting squatly. In this organized mayhem, a fully clothed man lies across the bottom of the image, more ghostly than our protagonist. It remains unsettlingly unclear as to whether he exists within the world of the image or whether his transparency suggests that he has moved somewhere beyond. This moribund uncertainty is a common feature of Singh's work, in which still bodies often lie in the middle of her scenes, either asleep or dead. Childlike play is highly characteristic of Singh's work from the 1980s onward. Elements of this playfulness continue to appear in her recent large-scale canvases. The world she envisions are never sacrosanct with clear divisions of outside and in, home and the world, life and death. Even in the many household scenes she paints, the space is furnished with chairs, tables, and sofas, churn with reminders of a world beyond the door, a world made mobile by boats, cars, and airplanes, ferrying people across huge, unimaginable distances. Birds, eternal symbols of movement and freedom, have soared to unwittingly arrive in these nonsense spaces. Nothing within these worlds can ground the viewer to a sense of lived reality. They are dreamlike, fantastical, and undeniably enchanted. These no places have earned Singh's reputation as a proverbial Alice, making her way down the rabbit hole and through the looking glass. Like Alice, she finds an upside-down world that in turn teaches us further about ours, elucidating its eccentricities, problems, and possibilities. Geeta Kapoor, who, as some of you may know, is a focal voice in South Asian art criticism, but also post-colonial art theory more generally, outlines the role of so-called fabrications in Singh's work, using this wordplay to point to the way the artists paint paintings start to quote the textural qualities of curtains, banners, or mantles. Thus, fabrication in Singh's work is doubly the process of translating painting into fabric, as well as the act of making and of doing, highlighting the labor and care involved in constructing her images. In her paintings of the 1980s in particular, her images of deconstructed domestic scenes might take on the effect of a frayed quilt in one portion of a painting, or the drapery that folds in on itself in another. Of the relationship of Singh's work to cloth, Kapoor states, and I quote, "The cloth has also to do with weaving, with sitting on a loom like Penelope, to prolong memory, and it has to do with the specific tasks of stitching, suturing, embroidering with multicolored yarns, and the blinding care that goes into female industry," end quote. It is in this notion of prolonging that Kapoor underscores the durational nature of the labor involved, the act of painting akin to the painstaking act of stitching, weaving, and embroidering. And like the Odyssey's Penelope, who weaves to deceive and beguile her suitors, Singh paints to confound her viewer with her painted fantasies of ghostly figures, of ducks, and of cars. It is in her use of pattern, decoration, and repetition that we recognize Singh's indebtedness to the aesthetics of embroidery. In Through the Wind, the multiple floral patterns evoke the sensibilities of Gatha, of which Singh is so fond. These floral patterns, long-standing symbols of a normative femininity, relate back to embroidery as a site and product of female labor. As Kapoor explains, the use of patterning in and of itself connotes the decorative, which has been understood in relation to craft and the so-called minor arts as a domain of women from a global perspective, and the realm of the indigenous artisan in the colonial context. This is, of course, where Singh's practice sees overlaps with the American feminists of the 1970s, who took patterning to reject modernist and thereby masculinist and male sensibilities, while underscoring patterning as a repetitious act of making. The use of pattern suggests a willful engagement with a doubly subaltern tradition, here redeployed in paint to assert newfound legitimacy and integration beyond the false binaries of the fine and the allied arts. As Kapoor states, and I quote once again, "In this perspective, one can see the ornamental principle in Arpita's paintings to be as much a modernist and indigenist as it is a feminist proposition," end quote. The embellished patterns that make up the grounds and borders of Singh's images reinforce ideas of an ad hoc and improvisational domestic labor, while also rejecting a definition of home as a necessarily hermetic, orderly, or organized entity. Her patterns and formal staging of figures and symbols also trouble the boundaries of the home and the world, of life and make-believe, inside and out. Her depictions of domesticity are messy, where the home that operates as a stage for women's work is recast as thoroughly entwined with the city at large. Living rooms bleed into the streets, allowing in airplanes, motorcycles, trains, and ships presented across a jumbled array of patterns juxtaposed next to each other. These talismans of a mechanized, automated industrial world weaving in and through rooms imply movement, migration, and motility, as do the ducks and pigeons that often accompany them. They also mark the processing of dreaming and of dreaming as doing, in which new realities and fictions are constantly being created. Using stitching as her formal tool, Singh paints at the fray while suturing its true edges, creating within the liminal space between dreaming and waking, home and the world, private and public, and lastly, between painting and textile. Now moving on to Neelima Sheikh, and she was born in 1945 in New Delhi and received her MFA from the Maharaja Sayajirao University in Baroda in 1971. Baroda, a provincial capital in the state of politically conservative Gujarat, unexpectedly emerged as a critical locus for experimental and anti-colonial pedagogy in the early decades after independence. And Sheikh belongs to a generation of artists who attended the institution at this transformative time. She was heavily influenced by K.G. Subramanian, a radical pedagogue who encouraged artists who were professionalized through art schools with all the connotations of class, caste, and access this implies, to remain actively engaged with India's extant and rich indigenous visual traditions, rather than blindly aligning themselves with what he saw as an Euro-American internationalist type of modernism. In keeping with her instructor's ethos, Sheikh took an active interest in both Persianate manuscript painting as well as pitchfire paintings from the Indian state of Rajasthan, in which large-scale devotional imagery is painted on cloth. And I've got some examples of both here for you. I'll focus my attention today on examples of images Sheikh painted in the 1980s before her practice started to expand in scale. At this time, Sheikh was drawing from her own ongoing experiences as a wife and mother living in faculty housing at the university in Baroda, where her husband is still a professor. We see markers of Indian middle-class existence as the primary subject of her work. These work elicit a growing interest in the translatability of fabric to paint, as I will show, all while sustaining an interest in the formal logic of Persianate miniature paintings, from which she derives the intimate scale of the image and the medium. Engaging two painting traditions, Mughal and Pitchfai, Sheikh turns private life outward for public spectatorship in images that take on the home as their stage. In Sunday Morning from 1983, which you see here, it is as though the viewer has happened upon an ordinary yet tender moment between mother and daughter. A woman combs through her young child's hair while they sit on low jute stools, an open bottle of oil sitting at the mother's feet with the bottle cap set at its side. The mother wears a forest green suit, paired with a loosely fitted polka dot salwar and the industrious chappals that are a staple of Indian homes, those are the sandals, and a dupatta or scarf covering her hair in a manner typical of the state of Gujarat. The daughter wears a blue frock and in one hand holds a hairband that had previously held her hair in place. This intimate scene is instantly recognizable as a weekend ritual among women in Indian families, when time is dedicated to hair as it is oiled, tended to, and washed. In Sheikh's rendition of this act of maternal care, the women sit in a liminal space of the home, caught between outside and in, reminiscent of sing spaces teetering on the brink of both. Beyond the women absorbed in their work, two cats tussle playfully, while a mesh screen door welcomes docile birds looking in. There's also a hint of another figure in the back, another female figure. In many instances, Sheikh uses decorative flourishes to structure the viewer's access to these different spaces. In the case of Doctor in the Family from 1984, Sheikh frames a scene of a medical checkup taking place in a bedroom with repeating floral patterns. In the center of the image, an elderly woman sits alongside the edge of the bed, looking up at the doctor who stands over her while checking her blood pressure. Here, Sheikh is attentive to the detailing of domestic objects, especially fabrics. The bedspread on which the woman sits has an ikat pattern along the edge. To the side, an open window lets in a hint of a fluttering dotted curtain, as well as leaves and flowers, presumably from plants in the garden beyond. Potted plants further line the bottom of the image, willfully unclear as to whether we might read the space as outside of the house or whether it's simply a decorative border in the style of Pitchfai paintings. As these plants also attract hungry bees, as you can see, one of my favorite details in this image, we understand that perhaps both elements are at play. In these small-scale images, Sheikh focuses on the role of matriarchs within the home, but does not specifically memorialize them. Instead, she chooses to highlight fleeting moments of everyday care. While doing so, Sheikh hones in on the quotidian objects that populate and make up Indian domestic spaces, including the many forms of traditional textile commonly found in furniture accents and clothing. Much like in Singh's work, textiles are present as discernible icons, but it is also in the way Sheikh chooses to order her images that she refers to fabric, printing, and embroidery. An image such as Doctor in the Family, for example, with its floral framing devices and flat, depthless perspective, mimics a quilted fabric, in addition to its embrace of the historic painting traditions of the subcontinent. The border of potted plants that runs along the bottom could double as the lining or the bottom of a sari. In Sunday Morning, particular attention is paid to the difference in textures and colors in women's clothing, each contrasting with the next. In the far corner of the image, a window looks out onto lush vegetation, painted in the manner of block printed fabric. These early images gestured towards a budding interest in the notion of fabric as base, ground and structuring device, which she's soon to further develop in the 1990s. Fabric negotiates the productive tension between fine art and craft, as well as between the act of domestic caregiving and women's work or labor. For Sheikh, the act of tending to the home, the practice of painting, and the manufacture of textile all converge around the process of making, doing, and performing, and are metaphors that channel a larger conception of care, the act of supporting the world and the people around oneself. The studious tailor she paints in Karigar, for example, bordered and framed so as to allow the viewer a window into a workspace, labors in the intimate environs of what could be a home studio. He sits on the floor on top of a checkered rug with sewing machine just beyond him, an armchair outside of the frame. In the border of the image are stencil-like images of interiors, windows, closets, and cupboards. A man sits in a chair on the left. A couple chats idly at the lower edge. This image of a karigar, or literally maker, repeats the structures of domestic worlds created in Sunday Morning and Doctor in the Family, in which the subject is framed closely within a small panel. As we encounter Sheikh's images, studio and home, workplace and living space, labor and care lose the distinctions that keep them purportedly hermetic. Just as the artisan works anonymously yet fastidiously to execute their craft, so does the mother or domestic worker so does the work of the mother or domestic worker oftentimes go unrecognized. Kumkum Sangari, who is a scholar who's written on Nilima Sheikh, marks this loss of selfhood, or rather notions of a non-proprietarian selfhood, as a part of Sheikh's feminism, a feminism that rejects the masculinist claim to a single authorial voice and to mastery. According to Sangari, the increasing use of repetition in her images and also of stencils worked onto the same image brings her into closer proximity with the laborer, one who performs a task multiple times over, the hand block printer or the embroiderer. This brings me to consider the conditions of production for all of the works I've discussed with you today. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Singh and Sheikh both worked out of their homes. Arpita Singh still uses her home studio in the neighborhood of Nizamuddin in New Delhi, in close proximity to her artist husband, Paramjit Singh. Until the 1990s, Nilima Sheikh did not have a dedicated studio space and worked in her Baroda home, as I mentioned previously. She cites this as one of the reasons why she was unable to make the shift to larger scale works until later in her career. In the proximity of the place of living, caring, dreaming, and of waking to the spaces of creating, making, and producing, I believe there's a vanishing point at which they start to become one and the same. The work of Sheikh and Singh exists at many frays, as I've hopefully shown today, but another salient fray or edge is one represented by the two worlds of home and studio. The former is conventionally thought of as internal, invisible, and private. Home is a place contained within and defined by its walls. It is intimate, familiar, and familial. It is what queer theorist Gayatri Gopinath would claim as a minor space, a space that exists within the machinations of the superstructures that organize our life worlds, such as the nation state, but that are relegated as secondary sites of meaning. The studio, however, is a place of creation, of doing and making, in which objects that are made are imagined to have a public afterlife. It occupies a similar image to the factory, the atelier, or the workshop, all of which point towards an external destination and circulation of social objects. The home studio, then, might assert a dissolution of these two differences. I suggest, as a thought to end with, that the hybrid and hyphenated home studio comes to inflect Singh and Sheikh's paintings, wherein space is reconceptualized as offering more diverse opportunities than simply being either outside or in. In the images I've shared with you today, the space of the home, its associations with maternal care and a femininity, also reaches towards an externalized space, the masculinized domain of the public sphere, the city, and the labor as it exists under imperial capital. By living at the cusp of both these possibilities, our artists affirm their work both as a form of homebound caregiving as well as of labor. This ultimately has resonances with feminist assertion that care work is a form of undervalued and underrepresented labor that goes unpaid and unnoticed. Twinned with this gendered notion, the artists are also able to invoke another perimeter, another fray that continues to exist in India and many other post-colonial societies between indigenous craft, here embodied in textile, and that of fine art. The force of these works apply pressure on established colonial hierarchies of knowledge that place the artist over artisan, art over craft, modernity over tradition, major over minor, and male over female. Instead, the works of Arpita Singh and Nilima Sheikh offer something that is not simply transcendental, but a vision of what it means to exist simultaneously across both nodes of these boundaries, a way of being at home in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sayantan, for that wonderful exploration of women artists in India and their interest in portraying domesticity. Just a reminder that we'll take Q&A at the end of the session, and if you have any questions, please type them in the box at the bottom of the screen. I would now like to introduce our final presenter, H.C. Arnold, who is presenting his paper entitled Other Play Acting, Performance Arts Colonialist Critique. H.C. is a PhD student at the University of California, Riverside, where he also studies modern and contemporary art. At this time, I would like to invite H.C. to begin his presentation.
Thank you all for being here and on this virtual space. It's nice to share with everybody what I have. And my screen is sharing, I hope. So I'm going to go ahead and begin. So good afternoon. I'd like to thank the University of Georgia for inviting me to be part of the AGAS Emerging Scholars Symposium for this year. It's nice to be with you, albeit in our sort of virtually distanced reality. Today, I will be speaking about part of my dissertation research on CARP. CARP was formed in 1975 by Marilyn Nix and Barbara Burden, and was a nationally funded and nonprofit pop-up exhibition collective formed out here in California during the latter half of the 1970s. This organization's mission was to secure the best location for artists to exhibit their work, free of as many financial limitations as possible. The roster includes Bruce Nauman, Eileen Sigalov, Vito Aconci, Diane Blell, Dennis Oppenheim, Cynthia Mahone, Chris Burden, Michael Brewster, Charles Christopher Hill, and Alexis Smith, among others. A critical component of CARP's practice was to never maintain a permanent exhibition space. This pioneering approach to exhibition practices kept costs low and audience reception diverse by affording the mobile collective the opportunity to show in various public locations, including a pedestrian tunnel in San Francisco, a private home in the Hollywood Hills, on various college campuses, and on commercial television stations. Now, for the case of Alexis Smith, mobility became a geocultural issue as much as a spatial one. With CARP's support for 5 nights in the late summer of 1976, Smith donned the ornate costume of a historical harem attendant and read from 1001 Arabian Nights to a small audience at a private gathering in an art gallery in Los Angeles. This event, titled Scheherazade the Storyteller, marked Smith's first performance, and it was no doubt aimed at evoking the atmosphere of the legendary Scheherazade herself as she spun her tales to the Persian Sassanid king Shahryar in order to spare her life and ultimately become his bride. This performance commenced with audience members being admitted into a candlelit portion of sort of the front section of Roger Wong's gallery that functioned as a greeting chamber. This threshold space was perfumed with incense. It was filled with the sounds of a bubbling fountain. It was furnished with Persian rugs, and it was framed by palm trees. There they were greeted by Zazu Fair, a 12-year-old girl costumed similarly to Smith. Zazu offered these guests an assortment of refreshments, including cookies, hash, and mint tea. As the audience members partook of these offerings, they rested comfortably on the carpet, becoming intoxicated in a fully immersive sensorial experience. After this prelude, Zazu escorted the placid crowd around the galleries, into the gallery's secluded rear. There it is. There in a space lit by the diffuse light of a kerosene lamp and laced with the trace smells of burning incense, they encountered a group of tall pillows surrounding an area occupied by another Persian rug where Smith was seated, waiting. The audience was instructed to recline on these pillows, and once they were resting comfortably, Smith gave selected readings for approximately 1.5 hours. According to one account, Smith read so beautifully and the tableau was so persuasive that the audience felt transported into a historic Islamic court. Now, Scheherazade, the storyteller, the West meets the East. The latter manifested through a small gathering during which Smith introduced Scheherazade, Majalis, and 1001 Arabian Nights to her friends and the Southern California art scene, in a quiet setting one could consider tinged with escapism and romanticism. Subsequently, Smith's performance contributes to an already extensive roster of aesthetic westernization of non-Western cultures. This catalog spans both history and media, with examples locatable in museums, concert halls, and popular theme parks. Simply consider the careers of Eugene Delacroix and Paul Gauguin, or the popularity of Disney's Aladdin and Mulan franchises for a few cursory examples. Although abridged, this list ensues from the historical scope of the West's aesthetic interest and employment of the Southern Euro-Asian cultures in various forms of media directed at all facets of society. Such a multiplicity attests to the West's capacity for cultural appropriation and the transportability of culture, or at minimum, the transportability of perspectives of a culture across time, place, and peoples. Ultimately, this cultural mobility participates in a broader project that reaches into geopolitics, scholarship, institutions, systems of knowledge, and economics. Taken in total, the West's interest in what it frames as the East often reveals itself as a colonialist gesture, which Edward Said defined as Orientalism. But here I want to consider Scheherazade's transportability within the canon of other performances occurring across California during the 1970s on the more limited terms of the art historical category performance art. Despite individual similarities between Scheherazade, the storyteller, and other performances, including their use of real time, the employment of the human body as their irreducible medium, functioning as the locus where text and image intersect, Smith's performance is unique. It utilizes a previously narrated non-Euro-American text created by various non-Euro-American authors, although compiled and translated into English, and it frames the East through its varied use of costume, setting, and sensorial aesthetics. Thus, the work sits at an intersection of performance art, Orientalism, phenomenology, and colonialist critique. In short, Scheherazade, the storyteller, and 1001 Arabian Nights manifest at the hands of Smith through sensorial aesthetics and play acting. What Said defined as the other, whether in costume, action, or setting, materializes in a spectacularized event that simultaneously reinforces the pre-existing assumptions and beliefs about the other on display, while also revealing the recurrent cannibalization of the anthropomorphized cliche. We witness a prime exemplar of Homike Bhabha's paradoxical concept of the stereotype, wherein the other is simultaneously regulated to stasis while perpetually repeated in various incarnations. Now, what to make of this apparent cultural appropriation occurring across a non-Euro-American folktale refashioned as a piece of performance art? There perhaps lingers the rudimentary desire to merely ascribe Smith's performance to a colonialist gesture roused by westernized romanticism and evidenced as the naivety of Smith and her audience. One may even contend such a position based on the performance's prominent and central blind spot, comprised of Smith, an American, costuming herself as a Persian. And this reading of racial play acting situates the work easily into the aforementioned Orientalist roster. Yet it would precede a line of reasoning only half articulated by Homike Bhabha's theory of cultural hybridity. To register Scheherazade the storyteller as cultural appropriation stops short at the colonialist subject's construction occurring only through the articulation of forms of difference, both racial and sexual. It requires Scheherazade materializing prior to Smith's performance as a person of, and I quote, original identity, signifying a singular point of origin that in turn establishes the Euro-American place of colonizer dominant over Scheherazade as the colonized. But I want to forego such a cursory and reactionary analysis, not least because the archival material of Smith's performance does not support such an approach, but also because I'm more interested in the consequential historical considerations of cultural hybridity manifesting within performance art. Specifically, how Scheherazade the storyteller speaks to the emergence of the modern global era by creating an interstitial passage between Southern California and the Southern Euro-Asian continent. Cultural hybridity, this essay suggests, then appears in diasporic and sensorial media. Defined not exclusively by social and cultural theories as an abstract concept, cultural hybridity also manifests in the art world. Scheherazade the storyteller renders such a hybridity, creating a liminal space where the artists of Southern California came face to face with their framing of the other, not as a colonialist gesture, but as a multi-sensorial performance. In order to accomplish such an event, Smith utilized a wide array of props and costumes. Smith's archival documents disclose the artists want to create an authentic Eastern experience within the confines of the diasporic objects available across Los Angeles in the 1970s. A collection of business cards, shown here, from local Iranian shops that Smith visited in her quest include Hamid's Imports, showcasing exclusive imports of Persian carpets, antiques, brass, copper, and enamel, the Aisha Ali Boutique, and Fountains and Falls by Zarco, listing statues, art objects, and antiques as its merchandise. Such a plethora of material at Smith's disposal afforded her the ability to exercise an extremely high level of curation when considering the diaspora she used in her performance. Two correspondences from the archive record successful finds. There's a loan receipt from Hamid's Imports documenting the borrow of 3 Persian carpets valued at $510, and the other letter requests borrowing a set of latticework screens from a boutique in Beverly Hills. These objects, along with incense burners, antique lamps, and a fountain, perhaps all from Zarco, all appear in the final performance. Smith's costume, similar in style to Zazu Fair's, exemplified the westernized framing of the other. In her preliminary designs, which you can see here, her attire comprised of a white kaftan, black harem pants, slippers, a sequenced choli top, an ornate tiara, and an elaborate panja bracelet. In addition to this ensemble, Smith also concealed her hair beneath a long black wig. The final photograph, also shown there, you can see Smith seated, garbed in her costume, absent the kaftan. As with the objects used in the performance, this clothing was dictated by its availability. Now, in addition to the objects and objects that Smith had available to her, imagery of the Global South circulated throughout Los Angeles during the 1970s in various print media. Arguably, the idea for Smith's ensemble came from one such set of images. These. The collection of Firoz Zahidi's photographs of Elizabeth Taylor in Tehran, published by Andy Warhol in Andy Warhol's Interview magazine. And Smith's archive contains a copy of this issue, this image here actually, that displays Taylor wrapped in an elaborately patterned hijab. But to continue, if we consider Scheherazade the storyteller not as a performance denoting the viewing of a spectacle from the beholder's vantage, but more as a space of commingling between the audience, Smith, Zazu Fair, Scheherazade, 1001 Arabian Nights, and the larger expatriate community of Iran residing in Los Angeles during the 70s, we can begin to think of these 5 nights as a performance, and I quote, beyond narratives of originary and initial subjectivities. Instead, the performance generates an interstitial passage that, and again to quote, prevents identities at either end of it from settling into primordial polarities. And I say that this is done through its multi-sensorial and multi-historical approaches to its subject matter. Smith's accomplishment of disavowing Scheherazade's role as a locus of cultural permanence occurs through the phenomenological concepts of sense, embodiment, synesthesia, and the body's sensory motor surfaces. These surfaces project the lived body outward onto its field of existence, engaging it with the more extensive stratum of phenomena comprising existence. Thus, and I quote, lived experience involves constant shifts in sensory figures and grounds, constant potentials for multisensory and cross-sensory interactions and correspondences. Figure-ground interplays in which one sense surfaces in the midst of another that recedes, in which positions of dominance and subordination switch or commingle and blur into synesthesia. These alterations in dominance and subordinations extend into the social realm, which is notable when, and I quote, the perceiver and the perceived blur and merge through sensuous contact. Various moments of sensuous contact during Scheherazade the storyteller transpire in the various and numerous tastes, sounds, sights, smells, and touches the performance employed for the participant's stimulation. A guest was at once enjoying the sweetness of the tea with a companion, as you see here with Barbara and Chris Burden, then inhaling the intoxicating odor of the hash, their sense of taste receding beneath their sense of smell, just as their companion was enjoying the meditative sounds of the fountain. Or maybe one took a pleasant solitude in the scent of the burning incense before noticing the softness of the Persian rug beneath their toes, their sense of smell suddenly or casually subsumed beneath their sense of touch. Their sensuous contact with each other and their environment transpired by sharing this plethora of sensual ephemeral material in the communal space of the gallery, situated as a more abstract collective body. These sensual relays would have been continuous as the performance progressed, thus denying the dominance of any one phenomenon over the other. Further, upon reclining on the large pillows and listening to Smith's reading, the various imagery fabricated in their minds would have been a continually shuffling array. Here, as with the phenomena of the entry chamber, contact occurs beyond the pillow's tactility by way of Smith's voice entering the audience's separate bodies and invoking a plethora of diverse imaginations. The structure that Smith employed contributed to these decentering moments of sensuous contact as well. Initially, the performance relied upon a loose repetition of its program, with each night following the same sequence of events. However, each iteration failed to produce identical results. Each night, a different audience arrived. A different audience participated in the event and enjoyed different refreshments. And each night, a different audience listened to a different selection from 1001 Arabian Nights. While the audience may not have been directly aware of these variations, Smith and Zazou would have been. Holding this fact against the repetitious nature of the stereotype, the colonialist demand for singularity breaks down. Suppose we were to take the misstep that Scheherazade is a symbol connoting a primordial fixity. In that case, each variation of Smith's performance must either be denounced against the desired singularity or read as containing a fixity only through its variation. Each encounter between Smith, Zazou, and the audience was rendered in the immediate moment, ensuring that even the same signs can be appropriated, translated, historicized, and read anew. Finally, there's the audience's familiarity with Smith. Just as Smith possessed a personal knowledge of her audience members, enough, I might add, to designate on what nights they attended so as to ensure a harmonious gathering, so too did the audience recognize Smith through her costume. In contrast to an audience witnessing an unknown performer assume Scheherazade's persona, as one might watching the ballet Scheherazade, with Smith's performance, the character appears through the known figure of Smith. Such a familiarity deconstructs the strict differentiation between the audience and the other, in that they are confronted with themselves within the other, yet albeit it is still different from them. Smith's performance is not an isolated occurrence of Scheherazade's appearance in another incarnation by any means. Numerous versions of the character have manifested in film and literature, and in every case, they've been, and I quote, defined by the ideology of the mode of expression internalized by that genre. Depending on what adaptation of 1001 Arabian Nights is being considered, each instance transforms the narrative and the characters into patterns current in the host culture, but its local colors, however, may be retained. Further, within each transformation, the foreignness of the original is sidelined for the receiving audience. Consider 1001 Nights that aired in 2000 on BBC Two broadcast. The advertising surrounding this two-part miniseries emphasized the tale's familiarity by aligning its magic, and I'm quoting here, magic, mystery, and epic adventure as comparable to Alice in Wonderland or Gulliver's Travels. Although all three tales possess fantastical elements, their comparison predicated on something more than merely selling advertisements is tenuous at best. However, the question of how a narrative is transported from one genre to the next essentializes the further issue that, By this standard, the genre's characters, devices, and narrative structures they contain must also be malleable and portable. Scheherazade, in this sense, becomes unmoored from the character's original text, just as the text becomes unmoored from itself. Splitting such as these produce disjointed renderings of the stories they contain within 1001 Arabian Nights, as they become dispersed in other media as standalone renditions. Genre and narrative transportability create a wellspring for postmodern authors such as Salman Rushdie. In his text, Harn of the Sea Stories, he combines British and Southern Euro-Asian narratives in order to reveal their interdependence and interconnections. Following a similar frame text format that Scheherazade participates in, Harun has told a story with the narration labeled Rescue Story number S1001 ZHT 42041RXI. As argued by the literary theorist Andreas Teverson, this esoteric notation in fact calls to mind 1001 Arabian Nights, evoked by the number 1001, and the letter ZHR possibly signifying Scheherazade. A second notation appearing in the Sea Stories further reads G1001RIM, again suggesting the presence of the Arabian Nights, this time cataloged with the Brothers Grimm, indicated by the letters RIM. These notations further disclose the various folktales' interdependence on each other. The implication of this is that the tales of different cultures are not separated from one another by rigid cultural divides and walls of force, but may share a number of significant features. Scheherazade, the storyteller, possesses its own cryptic inscription, alluding to the recycling and interdependence of cultural motifs. Along the top of the invitation to the performance is a script in the upper right-hand corner. This script contains the date Saturday, July the 5th, 1975, and it's written in the Iranian solar calendar, the Persian calendar, and the Gregorian calendar. Its inclusion on this invitation is merely aesthetic, in that it does not correspond to the performance's date or to anything relating to it. Instead, while it lends a bit of sort of aesthetic flair to an otherwise relatively drab typed invitation, it attests to the variances in the globally shared act of recording the passing of time. Further examination of this date script, particularly noted on the original invitation, discloses a border that you can see there around all of the dates. Thus, we can surmise that it was actually collaged onto this document from a source that simultaneously listed all three dates. Here, visualized is the very intercitality manifested between the various cultures living throughout Los Angeles. Like Harn of the Sea Stories, Scheherazade may first appear to be a fixed notation of a culture succumbed to the colonialist gesture of the I and the other so astutely described as Orientalism. However, a more thorough explanation of its various entities reveals its permeable boundaries that slip between the West and the East to conflate these two identities together. While much of this is accomplished through the diaspora of the Islamic expatriate community Smith incorporated into her performance, a large part is rendered through the ephemeral material of the senses. Beyond written words, formed statues, or painted images, the aesthetics of the sensorium lend themselves to revealing the transitory nature of culture. At once present, they slip into each other, always fleeting and on the cusp of evaporation, as Smith did when, with her readings finished, she closed her book and her audience was led back into the darkness away from her. Thank you.
Thank you, HC, for that great paper on the impact of modern performance art and its connection to colonialist theories. I can already see Sayantan's back on the screen, so we'll begin the Q&A. Please remember to type your questions in the box below. And let's see, first question. Let's see. Our first question is for Sayantan. Have you thought about the mixed media art of Nalini Malani? Her Hamlet Machine, 1999-2000, fits into the politicized feminist landscape of the 20th century women artists of India. I realize since she doesn't use textiles, she might be out of your purview, but she does deal explicitly with colonialism, i.e. the Salt March.
Yes, thank you so much. absolutely love Nalini's work. And of course, it's an easy extension to make from the work of Nilima and Arpita and Nalini, who are all actually really good friends. But because my purview is a little bit more focused on the notion of textile and the way that that gets invoked in kind of, at least from what I've shown in painting, that's what I've kind of focused on. But Nalini and Arpita and Nilima all kind of belong to this kind of emergence of a self-consciously maybe feminist art in South Asia in the 1980s. So yeah, thank you for that.
The next one is for HC. Do you know whether Smith interviewed community members or otherwise included the Persian American community in her preparation beyond buying things? Do you know whether her audiences were indeed members of those communities?
That's a great question. I am very much under the impression that she was involved, or at least had interviewed and spoken with certain members of the community. I don't know specifically who at this time. I'm still researching into this project some. But that's a great line of area to dig into more. As far as her guests, the audience list was a relatively small and selective list, and I need to go back and review it, but I know that she was only allowing 10 people into the room a night. So she was creating this sort of small setting, but the specifics of those, that's a great question that I can follow up on for sure. Thank you.
Okay. We have another one for Sayantan. Why do you see the image as not sexual? To me, her pose, the position of her legs, the visibility of her bra, etc., make it rather a focus on the sexuality of middle-aged Indian women, or was I misunderstanding?
That's a really good question and a really interesting reading. I mean, I can honestly see both. I was citing another scholar. I was actually citing Geeta Kapoor, who has kind of read these images. What I think has become a dominant dominant reading of these images is that they are somewhat desexualized in that they're oftentimes kind of not presented in the nude or with kind of with any sense of unabashed nakedness. They are oftentimes kind of cloaked or covered, like the ones that I've shown. They don't kind of fall into art historical tropes of the nude, which hypersexualize the female body. They kind of do something different. But I do think that there's another reading quite easily to be made, such as this one, that actually it foregrounds the body of the middle-aged woman. It actually calls her to focus. It actually creates a new understanding of sexuality, maybe a non-normative understanding of the possibilities of female sexuality. So I definitely see both in tension. But because my reading borrows so heavily from Geeta Kapoor's, I haven't strayed away from that dominant interpretation of her work, I guess.
These are just two comments. I see for you, Sayantan, I see the influence of Chagall too, the whimsy of the animals, the color palette, but I'm just a fan, not a scholar. And then her pose is reminiscent of Egon Schiele, to me, almost as comment on the explicit sexuality of those nudes. And then another question for you, Sayantan, about Chagall. Did Singha know about the works of Chagall, and in a way, what was available to her, and in what ways does her color and form evoke Chagall's work? If you could maybe cite an example.
Absolutely. So she definitely is, I think, very consciously invoking Chagall in her work. The ways in which I kind of see the connection between Arpita Singh's work and Chagall's, you'll see in a lot of Chagall's work that they are also quite fantastical. The free-floating body is something that Chagall does a lot of, which you can see in Arpita's. The example that I gave of Through the Wind, you don't see it quite so much because you can kind of make out a ground on which she's sitting kind of squatly. But in a lot of images, they're kind of more spectral, ghost-like. They're suspended between different spaces. And I think that that's something that you see in Chagall's work also. She personally, I don't think has ever come out and said that she's drawn from Chagall. She has said, though, that Henri Rousseau and Paul Klee are big influences on her. But once again, the scholarship, primarily by way of Geeta Kapoor, who is just kind of the inimitable voice in South Asian art history, that this connection between Chagall and Arpita has become almost common. But that's where I see it really in their kind of use of the figurative and in the use of perspective, really.
That's great. We have another question. This is for Sayantan. I too would be interested in you discussing the pose more in the first work you discussed. It looks like a variation of a yoga pose.
I can't speak to that necessarily, but it is a very interesting pose. It's always struck me for how awkward it is, but it also, I think, just kind of looks like a way in which and this is anecdotal, but it just looks like the way that my grandma used to sit on the floor. Honestly, you hug your knee, it's again, a kind of quotation of an ordinary domesticity or a normative domesticity, I think, in like the way that women are expected to act, or in the way in which they do kind of. So it does look a little bit like a yoga pose. I don't know if that's really what it is. To me, it just looks as though the woman is kind of sitting in a way that suggests relaxation or repose, at least the way I read it. So, but it's something I want to think about more, because I've heard from other people that the pose is really what attracts them first to the image. So,
okay, that interesting. The pose is very interesting. We have another question for you, Sayantan. Could you talk about the use of perspective in the traditional cloth paintings and in sheiks?
That's a really great question. Obviously, it's not a one-point perspective, vanishing point perspective, like you see in the European tradition. What's most interesting, I'll speak to Nilima Sheikh's. It's part of the larger chapter, but Nilima Sheikh is actually very much indebted to the Bengal school of painting at the turn of the 20th century. And as some of you may know, the Bengal school painters like Abanindranath Tagore were looking eastward as a kind of anti-colonial gesture. So they were really drawing from Chinese ink paintings and Japanese paintings. And Nilima Sheikh is very much thinking about the Bengal school artists in her work and is drawing from them. And a lot of the perspective that you see actually comes from what I would say comes from Japanese ink paintings, the fukinuki yatai technique, which is the roof blown off technique, so that you have a kind of partial aerial oblique view into spaces. That's something that she uses a lot of. Of course, the perspective in devotional imagery is oftentimes kind of hierarchic. So it's usually Krishna in Pichvai paintings. He'll be the largest, and then there'll be a kind of hierarchy of scale. I don't see that as much in Nilima's work, but it's a fantastic question about perspective, and something that I go on to in much more detail in the longer chapter if anybody ever wants to read that.
Yes, very interesting. The manipulation of kind of your one-point linear perspective is always interesting. I do not think we have any further questions. Wait, never mind. One just popped up. Does Sheikha use Japanese paper, or did any of the Bengali artists as well?
No, so Sheikh used, she uses Wesley paper in these images, which are the same, which is the same medium that was used in Persianate miniature paintings. It's a very special type of paper onto which you apply gouache paint. So I don't actually think that she was using Japanese paper particularly, yeah.
Okay, we have one more question. This is also for Sayantan. How is Wesley made?
I would have to look more into that. It's actually quite a particular process, because the thickness of that paper is really important. So I'd actually have to, I wouldn't want to say because I'd be guessing mostly, but it's a very particular type of paper, kind of more like akin to card.
Right. We have another question. This is for Sayantan. Thank you so much for a marvelous paper. I love your idea of the hybrid studio home space and wonder whether or not the fray you identify helps redefine artwork as care work. Is there a political aspect of the artist's work as well, or are you primarily focusing on the conditions of production?
What a wonderful question. I definitely, that is something that a connection that I'm trying to draw. The question about politics is also a great one because it's not something I was able to speak to in the talk today, but also a part of the larger chapter. So it's interesting. There is a very particular allergy that you'll notice among Indian women artists of this generation to the term feminism, but their work really did start to come to the fore with the growth of India's women's movement, the Indian women's movement in the 1980s. So even though they might not see themselves as feminists, and quite openly, like Mrinalini Mukherjee, who I didn't get to speak about today, she's very open about not being a feminist and really kind of trying to distance herself from the term. The way in which scholars have already started to contextualize these artists is in a language of kind of emergent feminist discourse. And there are other artists like Nalia Malani, who was mentioned earlier. But so of course, I'm something I'm interested in the way that they've been received, and they've almost been canonized as these kind of feminist artists. But I am really looking in this chapter at the modes of production, and in that kind of trying to trace a Marxist feminist logic almost. So I hope that answers your question. But yes, that kind of connection between art making and care work, or art making be an extension of care work or as a part of one's care praxis, is something I'm really interested in. And if anyone has any recommendations for bibliographic reading for that, I would be so happy to hear from you. So thank you so much.
Okay, we have another question. Someone says, Sayantan, please get in touch. I have written an essay on this. I think on feminist art and care work. I think that is all the questions we have for today. So just as closing remarks, I would like to thank everyone in attendance and all of the presenters for their wonderful presentations and thought-provoking research. If you need to get in contact with any of the organizers for the symposium or ask any further questions, please email uga.symposium@gmail.com. Thank you all for attending, and we wish everyone a great rest of their weekend.